don't share that. So there are many, that's a very complex question. Another workshop. The Civil Rights Act is in 1964, and in 1967, and this is where this starts to get pertinent to what we're talking about today, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act to protect employees 40 and older from discrimination in the workplace. Okay, so 1967 that happens. And that's key because all of these become about compliance. So it's not that organizations are going, hey, wow, let's get a more diverse workforce. But it's that instead people are entering the workforce or trying to enter the workforce and asking for the opportunity to enter the workforce, but they are still being discriminated against. So the government passes legislation to pass that, and suddenly companies must comply, but they're not actively seeking to diversify. 1975, the Age Discrimination Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of age. So this makes it illegal for someone to ask you how old you are when you apply for a job. So again, age becomes about compliance. Pregnancy Discrimination Act, Americans with Disability, Family and Medical Leave Act. So we keep having more and more of these acts to protect the diversity in our workforce. 2000s, you're seeing now where it's moving to is a lot of legislation on sexual orientation. Nothing at the federal level yet, but definitely lots of states that are offering legislation on that. But what happens in this story is that as companies are complying, and you have affirmative action, so many government companies as well, as they're complying and they're diversifying their workforce, they discover a benefit. And what's the benefit? Innovation. Yeah. And why is it that diversity creates greater innovation?
Different perspectives.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So suddenly you're getting people who, when you had a group who had a very similar shared worldview, perspective, value system, it would narrow the way that they would create ideas, even creating products. Suddenly you get other people coming in with completely different worldviews, completely different values, who are coming up with ideas that are not only different to that original core group, but also speak to many of the groups they come from. So, fantastic story with PepsiCo, that when it involved some of its Hispanic employees on product development, and they came up with an idea for chips that had flavors like jalapenos. Made $100 million in the first year out. Because it said, hey, they said, let's actually make products for our community. And that's where diversity comes in. So now companies are saying, wow, let's diversify. And they're trying to add diversity to their workforce. And in fact, the most successful companies, research is showing, have diversity strategies in place in order to bring that innovation, that creativity into their workforce. But what we're focusing on today is generational innovation. Now, this is very new. 5 years ago, about 5 years ago, I was giving speeches on this drum that started to beat. And the drum was, the millennials are coming, the millennials are coming, the millennials are coming. Oh my God, the millennials are coming. The millennials are Gen Y, born 1980, 1981 to 2000. And there were all these articles on, here come all these kids, here come all these millennials. And they are a generation like one we have never seen before. So in order to retain them, recruit them and retain them, you're going to have to put nap pods in your company where they can take naps during the day. And be prepared, because not only are you going to deal with them as a manager, you're going to have to talk to their mom and dad too.
Wow.
So this is a generation who is very involved. They were required to be involved with volunteerism in order to get into college, but they were getting prepared for college at age 3. going to, I have friends who are sending their kids to, this is the best Montessori school in the community for $20,000 a year. Every kid from this school gets into Harvard. So that's this mentality. Also very involved in team events, sports, and again, volunteering. But in the team events, for them, it's not about winning. It's actually just about everybody gets a prize because they participated. But imagine what that means when you suddenly go into an adult world workforce. So all these employers were getting freaked out about the fact that the millennials are coming. What are we going to do? We have to completely change our way of doing business. And my message at the time was, take a deep breath, calm down. Actually, no, you don't. You can make a few changes to meet them halfway, but you don't have to completely change your business structure, your business model. At the same time, though, that this was happening, the baby boomers start to retire. And again, people are freaking out because they're thinking, what are we going to do? We've got all this brain power that's leaving. What are we doing about succession planning? How are we going to transfer that brain power? Now, interesting, in 2012, and what experts are thinking is going to happen over the next 5 years, is actually you're going to see quite a few of the war generation, which I will define who that is in a moment, the war generation coming back into the workforce. Many of them for financial reasons, because of the economy, but also many of them because they get into retirement and think, I don't feel there's much value to my life. I want to still be contributing. So many of them are coming back in different ways, and companies are helping them come back with very creative ways, which is why it's the first time in American history that we have 4 generations in the workplace, which is a very exciting phenomenon. So what is a generation? Because I think that helps to define what do we mean by a generation. A generation is a group of people programmed at the same time in history, coming of age in a distinct era with its own perspective on leadership, communication, problem solving, and decision making. Coded with data about what is right and wrong, good and bad, stylish and unstylish. Sharing a common set of formative events and trends, headlines and heroes, music and mood, parenting styles and education systems. As they age, they adjust behaviors and they do build skills, but they generally do not change their views. Now, I have one grandmother who is 96 and another who is 102. And I have just recently been putting them on videotape and capturing their life stories. And it is interesting to see, in many ways, my 96-year-old grandmother uses Facebook, and she thinks it's really cool. But to hear them talk about their views, fundamentally, a lot of their values and views have not changed over the years. They are who they are. And when you compare that to their generation, that they're really do represent their generation. So can we adapt? Can we change? Absolutely we can. But we are very much shaped by the era in which we grew up. Any questions so far before I move on to this? I know you're all wondering, yeah, but what's Gen X? So I'm going to tell you. Okay, so here's the 4 generations. So 1920, now I should say these years are ish. Right, you can't really say, right, 1922, January 1922 is when the war generation began. So give or take a few years on either end. 1922 to 1945, these are called the veterans, silent, the traditionalists. So they grew up during the Great Depression. They remember very well the war. Many of them fought in the war. 1946 to 1964, these are the baby boomers. So these are people who were born after the war. They, as I said earlier, they grew up at a time when there was a huge shift in social consciousness in terms of questioning authority, changing norms, pushing back against societal norms. 1965 to 1980, Gen X. Now, poor Gen X. They got a bum rap for a while because they were called the slackers. They were called people who they weren't really making any impact on society. A lot of them were latchkey kids because the baby boomers, and we'll get more into detail of this in a second, but the baby boomers were actually pushing the boundaries against marriage, lots of divorce in the age of baby boomers. So a lot of the Gen Xers were latchkey kids, raising themselves, coming home and letting themselves in. So some of you might find that you have crossover with these. So I'm going to give my age away here, but I was born in '64, and I find that I identify both with the baby boomers and with the Gen Xers. I remember going to, a very young age obviously, but I remember going to anti-Vietnam War protests with my parents. So that's a strong value in me. I remember social activism is a strong value in me, but I also really identify with Gen Xers. What's interesting about Gen Xers, we give the next generation, Gen Yers, who were born 1981 to 2000. Let's scoot over here so you can see a little more.